again, shouting the battle.
Patrick K. O'Donnell is a best-selling, critically acclaimed military historian and an expert on elite units. The author of 13 books, including The Indispensables, The Unknowns, and Washington's Immortals. He is the recipient of numerous national awards. Patrick served as a combat historian in a Marine rifle platoon during the Battle of Fallujah and is a professional speaker on America's conflicts, espionage, special operations, and counterinsurgencies. He has provided historical consulting for DreamWorks award-winning miniseries Band of Brothers, which must have been interesting, and for documentaries produced by the BBC, the History Channel, and Discovery. Patrick, welcome, and thank you for being here tonight.
It's an honor to be with you today, and thank you, Jeffrey. I'm a huge fan of the museum. I've been there at least a half a dozen times, and I encourage anybody that's watching this that hasn't been to the museum to go, because it's a great museum.
Well, thank you, and I'll do the same plug for you. Anyone who hasn't read this book, please do it. And Patrick and I were having a little chat before the program started, and it's definitely a unique look at the war. It's not often that you find these sort of new takes on stories. Sure, there's some new research that happens or putting things in different contexts, but this is something that a lot of people haven't explored. In fact, I don't think there's been a significant work on the irregulars of the Civil War era. So how did you come across this story, and why did you choose to write about it?
I've been a full-time author and historian for 25 years, and this has been my passion. It began when I was 4 years old, even when I just got into history. But having said that, I've written 13 books, and all of them have found me in one way or another. And it's unique. I mean, it's everything from when I went to Fallujah, I came home with the Marine Corps. I was at Camp Pendleton alone, because I asked my parents not to go because it was a tremendous experience. But there I was greeted by Marines from 3-1 who were in the Korean War and said, "We defended a hill against all odds against a Chinese regiment." And boom, there was my book. In this case, I was driving around Northern Virginia, and I found a rusted old sign that said the Grapewood Farm Engagement. And I'm like, well, I always stop for these signs. I'm sure you probably do too, Jeff. And it's like, I went there and I'm like, wow, what's this? And it's where John Singleton Mosby used a miniature mountain howitzer to disable his first train. And it was at the Grapewood Farm that they had kind of a funnel of death where there was the scores of Union cavalry that was pursuing him and his men after they had destroyed the train, and they used the mountain howitzer to great effect. But in many cases, many of the men there were in his command were also killed or wounded or even captured. And it was a significant milestone of like, this is a really amazing thing. And it was only a few miles away from the area that I was really familiar with. And I thought to myself, I'd love to do a book on Mosby, but with today's culture, it might be impossible. And I then was at another place that I would always frequent called the Front Porch Restaurant, and it was there I was editing my book called The Unknowns, which is on the body bearers that brought home the tomb of the unknown soldier. And right next to the front porch where I was editing my book is a sign for the last moments on earth of a Jesse Scout. And I was immediately intrigued. And a Jesse Scout named Jack Sterry was there, and it was emblematic of really this entire book. He was at the crossroads in the Plains, Virginia, trying to lead General Hood's corps down the wrong road. And it's the day of Second Manassas, and Hood's corps is moving up the road, and they're supposed to go through Thoroughfare Gap to meet up with the rest of the Confederate forces there. But Jack Sterry is in Confederate uniform, but he's a Union scout, and he's directing them down the road towards Middleburg. And he's super convincing. He's in his Confederate uniform. He's a scout. He's telling Hood's men, and even Hood himself, that he has orders from General Jackson that they're needed immediately at Middleburg so they can rally and move out at that point. And it's an ongoing story of back and forth with Jack and how he's just so convincing, but he has, there's things that are awry, that they don't make sense. He's got officer's insignia when he's an enlisted man, but he's got an immediate story saying, the women of the South love officers. They don't like enlisted men. He's got kind of a comeback for everything, but then they start to unmask who this man is. And he eventually admits who he is. And he says, I want to die as a Jesse Scout. And he's hanged there on the spot. And that's what this story is about. The through line of this book, The Unvanquished, is about the Jesse Scouts. And that was an untold story until this book. The thrust of this book is about handfuls of men that dress as Confederates. And they do everything from battlefield reconnaissance to deliver messages between the armies to capture high-value targets. In many ways, they are 100 years ahead of their time. And it is a fascinating story. But what is also unique is it connects directly to the Grapewood Farm engagement, whereas a group of these men would hunt John Singleton Mosby and the South's most dangerous men, including the Confederate Secret Service. And I tell the three stories in this book and how they intersect and how they profoundly change the course of the Civil War. And it's a different look at the Civil War. It's a look at the Civil War in many ways from an irregular perspective, from a special operations perspective, and from the perspective of an insurgency. And as we know from the 20th century, insurgencies are nearly impossible to defeat if they have the support of the population. And the South had that. And it's a story of how the South is turning towards irregular warfare because they realize that they can't win the war, but they can survive it if they use irregular means. And those irregular means are everything from Mosby's men tying up tens of thousands of troops to direct election interference to ultimately even assassination.
Yeah, and you sort of go through that perspective, and you look at it from both sides. Obviously,
I'm a camera. I just put myself in that time period, and I let the story and the individuals tell that story themselves through their own words. It's almost all entirely primary sources. Many of some of the stuff has never been published, but it provides you with the drama of 1864 and 1865 from the participant standpoint, and it's in many cases terrifying.
Yeah, it is, and we'll get into some of that. And before we deep dive into it, it's always interesting to find out how you became an author. Can you share that with us?
Sure.
What intrigued you, and you said you've been doing it for 25 years, but how did it all start?
Yeah, it started when I was 4 years old. I've been obsessed with military history since then. I went to the Bay Village local library, and kids my age, I was a youngster. I picked up a book that was probably 10 pounds. I'm only about 30 at the time. It was an American history in photographs of the American Expeditionary Force. Mm-hmm. And it was a hardcore book for a 4-year-old to look at, but I was obsessed with it. And I took it home, and I was getting books left and right. I had a collection of 700 or 800 books. My first love was the Civil War. Always. And then it progressed from there. This never left me. It's not something I just suddenly became a historian or an author. It's always been with me. I was dragging my parents to Civil War battlefields, and it would be the most obscure things when I was 6 and 7 years old. And my father would be like, well, you've seen one battlefield, you've seen them all. I'm like, no, Dad, we got to go to the peninsula. We got to go to, wherever. And I was obsessed, and we did it. And through college, it was history. And right after it, I was interviewing World War II vets when nobody else was. And my obsession was with the elite units of World War II. And I probably had the largest private archive in the world of oral histories, written accounts from members of the 82nd Airborne, the 101st, Merrill's Marauders, the Rangers, and the OSS. Interviewed everybody that was alive, that was behind the lines, men and women, And then it would span everything from World War I to modern war. And it just went from there. I created a website called thedropzone.org, which is a virtual museum and oral history site. Veterans said, why don't you write a book? Ended up being, when I was 29 years old, the youngest historian from the major publishing house was Simon and Schuster in the country at the time. And it was a best-selling book, Beyond Valor. And I've been doing it for 25 years since July, 25 years ago. So it's been a passion. And I haven't really, as I said to somebody today off the cuff, I haven't worked for 25 years because I love what I do, even though I spend a lot of time doing it.
Yep. I bet you a lot of us on this call are very jealous that you've been able to have a job that I like my job, but I'm sure that a lot of people can't say the same thing. So that's great that you're able to turn this childhood obsession and love affair into a career. And with that, let's pivot back to the book. Now that we have a little bit about you and your writing. And so obviously the Jesse Scout, where does that name come from? What's the founding of this? How does this story begin?
This begins in 1861 in Missouri, and it's specifically related to John C. Fremont, the Pathfinder, the great explorer of the American West. It's John C. Fremont that employs scouts in the West, and to great effect. He then becomes, after that period of time, he becomes the United States Senator from California, the first Republican candidate for president. But it's in 1861 that he's given a command of Missouri. And, everybody, this is a very much a hotly contested area where it's brother against brother, but neighbor against neighbor. It's a real mess. And it's within this sort of environment that John has to try to take command and control. And he reintroduces the scouts. And he brings in some of the old men that he had from the American West, as well as others. And they do some really amazing things, and their tradecraft is fascinating and interesting. They name themselves Jesse Scouts after John's wife, Jessie Ann Benton Fremont, who's a remarkable woman, a real Renaissance woman for the time. A brilliant woman, but also she's a senator's daughter. She can handle things. I mean, she takes care of business for John in many cases. There's a great line in the book from a contemporary historian that says that she is actually the better man of the two. I mean, she's just an incredible woman. And the men all look up to her, and it's she that they believe that is the first to suggest that they dress in Confederate uniform to do their jobs. And as I mentioned with Jack's Dairy, it's an incredibly perilous, thing to do, to dress in the enemy's uniform. You're considered a spy if captured, and you're immediately executed, or, in most cases, you die. And it's one of the reasons why the Jesse Scouts really remained an untold story, because most of these men never came home. And it's from there that there's a really interesting and fascinating story. The Scouts have a checkered past, especially in the beginning. Their commanding officer is a guy by the name of Carpenter, and Carpenter is fascinating. He's a braggart. He's a big time anti-slaver. Claims that he was with John Brown. There's no evidence of that, but he and also claims he's a crack shot, which may or may not be true. But he's a guy that just can get in and out of like incredible situations. Helps develop some of this tradecraft, but he's got a dark side. He will steal anything that's not nailed down. And some of these guys take after their commanding officer, and the unit gets a bad reputation. By 1862, it's a real problem. And then when John Fremont doesn't take command of an army because John Pope does, he's passed over, he resigns. And it's the Scouts that pretty much, Carpenter is cashiered out of the army for his antics. And it's at this point that the scouts are almost eliminated, but there's a small remnant that survives, and it's passed along to various commands. And it's really when General Averill takes the scouts in West Virginia that they sort of get new life. And he arms them with, in some cases, repeating rifles or carbines. And he puts them immediately out front of his armies. And it's in West Virginia that the story really blossoms, because West Virginia, like Missouri, is very much a very contested area between both sides. It's also where the major supply routes, the major railroads and major roads run through. So both sides are interested in it. There's a lot of minerals as well. And it's here that there's a lot of inner fighting between, neighbor against neighbor. It's in Appalachia that a lot of these things take place. And it's here that the scouts are given new life under Averill, but also they're used to hunt Confederates. And they specifically go after a group of men known as Thurman's Rangers. And it's the Thurmans that operate in and around what's now Thurman, West Virginia, that they go after these guys. And another element within this is Richard Blazer and his independent scouting unit, which are mostly Jesse Scouts. They're intertwined.
Yeah,
and they hunt Thurman's Rangers.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and it's here that the scouts and irregular warfare within this cauldron of West Virginia, which comes into the Union as a slave state in the summer of 1863, really begin to gel.
And obviously, as you said, they begin to gel, and it is that 1863-65 where it seems like the heart of the story really is. But obviously, they're coming up on some pretty stubborn Confederates. John Singleton Mosby being one of them, really the primary sort of antagonist of the Jesse Scouts. Can you tell us who he was and how his Rangers were formed?
Sure. It's in West Virginia that the Jesse Scouts kind of go against the Thurman's Rangers, which is kind of the JV team compared to John Singleton Mosby and his Rangers. These guys, I told Mosby's story because I wanted the reader to understand just what the Jesse Scouts were up against. They were absolutely formidable, and pretty much any force that John Singleton Mosby encountered, they destroyed, and they were incredibly effective. It begins the story for John Singleton Mosby really begins in 1862, where he is a scout with Jeb Stuart, and he's the famous ride around Richmond. He's there. He does amazing things, and it's early fall 62, and he asks Stuart, "I'd like to make a partisan group." Stuart's a little bit skeptical, and he wants to do it in the Northern Virginia area. He says, "Okay, you got one guy with a club foot. That's all I can spare at this point." And Mosby moves on towards a train station, and his career as a partisan ranger is over before it begins. They surround a company of Union cavalry surround him at the station. He doesn't even have his pistols. They're on his horse, and he is immediately captured along with the other man. And Mosby is incarcerated by the Federals, and for several months. But a prisoner exchange really changes his life and gives him a second chance. And it's really here that you sort of see Mosby at his best, because this guy's captured, but he somehow makes a lemon into lemonade. He's going from Fort Monroe on a Union steamship on his way to Richmond, and he somehow turns this disadvantage into an opportunity. He notices that the captain has Southern sympathies. He just, he's able to detect it. And then he talks to this captain, and from that discussion, he's able to determine that the captain knows about Union troop movements that were very recent that occurred that have strategic level importance. And he's able to sort of put the pieces together. He's also able to observe things from the boat. And within this, with this intelligence, this actionable intelligence, he has a real strategic notion of what the Union is going to do. And as soon as the steamboat lets him off at Richmond, Mosby doesn't waste 1 second. He immediately rides to General Lee's headquarters and shows up as this little lieutenant who's got this dusty uniform from riding for hours to get to the headquarters, and somehow he talks his way in. And he's immediately skeptical, but realizes who he's talking to. He remembers sort of what he did with Stuart, and the intelligence is indeed good, and it's responsible for a Confederate victory. The intelligence that Mosby furnishes. And then we sort of fast forward a few months to the winter of 1862, where Mosby is at right outside of Middleburg, Virginia, at a place called Oakham. It still exists. Mm-hmm. By the way, many of the sites that are in the Unvanquished, it's really a driving tour. I did the map specifically so you can go visit the places that I talk about. And much of it is preserved in that, it's some of the most beautiful country in the United States. This is the area of Loudoun County, Prince William County. Much of it's still preserved, and you can visit these places such as Oakham. And it's here that he convinces Stuart to give him a handful of men, and they set off. And John Singleton Mosby sets off and creates the origins of, in many ways, modern irregular warfare, because this is our first modern war, but also special operations. It's really, truly extraordinary story. And it's galvanized within a month or so when they capture a Union general right out of the belly of the beast at Fairfax, right under the eyes of thousands of Union cavalry, and brings him back. And it crystallizes Mosby's command, and this small group of a handful of men eventually mushrooms into something that's nearly 1,000 strong, and will tie up tens of thousands of Union troops eventually, and pioneer and usher in a new form of warfare.
Yeah, and he wasn't for the first look at him, you wouldn't think of him as your sort of typical cavalryman. You say he's a bookish lawyer, you're right, and that he was 5'7" and he drank coffee and not alcohol.
It was my favorite thing. There's a famous quote in there. He loved the original bean. He would not go for any ersatz coffee. He would just go. He wanted the original coffee. He never drank. He's a wiry guy that just has amazing gravitas. And he's just brilliant, and he knows how to lead, and he's a micromanager to some degree, but he's brilliant, and he will change the course of history.
Yeah, and you make it clear that he was definitely in charge of the Rangers. There's no question about that.
None at all.
Yeah, and so you also mentioned at least a little bit in the book about Robert E. Lee's view. We talk about you're talking about the Irregulars as sort of new group of men that are going behind the lines, and I said putting on the opposing units' uniforms and trying to gain information or misdirect units, whatever they're doing. What was Lee's view on all of this?
Lee is constantly torn in many ways between irregular warfare and understanding it to some degree, but also it goes against his sense of honor and discipline. And he's often, torn between that view, which is for the South a positive and a negative, in the sense that he recognizes the importance of it. And it's Lee that actually recognizes the importance of the rising Copperhead movement, for instance, within the Democratic Party in 1863 and 1864, and using the Confederate Secret Service to manipulate that party for his ends, and to remember They don't have to win the war. They merely have to survive. And he has an understanding of that to some degree, but it's, as I bring out in the book, it's also Lee that probably brings the nation back together, because it's Jefferson Davis that really has a great understanding of irregular warfare. And it's in many cases, that's an untold story to some degree. His understanding of irregular warfare is way ahead of its time, and it's dangerous. Because if Lee had conducted himself in a different manner, the war could have lasted, much longer. And thankfully it didn't. But
and you're really talking about at Appomattox and at that point of the war in particular, as the Southerners the Confederacy was surrendering instead of becoming irregular troopers going into the Blue Ridge Mountains and other places that they all surrender. Is that sort of where you're heading with that?
That's one thing. I mean, it's Jefferson Davis that is the puppet master in many ways, the titular head of the Confederate Secret Service. He orders many of almost all the operations. He's involved, deeply involved, and it's novel stuff that is way ahead of its time. It's everything from election interference to influencing the press operations to expanding Mosby's ideas into a grander scale. It's also the understanding that we can leave the cities like Washington did during the American Revolutionary War and conduct ourselves in a different manner. And that is something that clashes with Lee. And it's Lee that at Appomattox does something very bold. Jefferson Davis's orders to Lee are to conduct guerrilla warfare and to break up the army. He disobeys direct orders from Jefferson Davis because he recognizes that is not in the best interest of America or the South in the long term. And in that sense, the reunification of America begins at Appomattox with his decision. And it's Grant's statesmanship as well, which treats his vanquished, his foe with respect rather than dishonor, which then sets up the fact that there are still almost 200,000 Confederates in the field that are still able to fight and are willing to fight under Johnson and others. And they do for months and months and months. But it's that surrender that changes things, and it's General Lee that changes things as well. And it's the men are fighting for Lee in many cases. So when he is not going to be a guerrilla warrior, that changes everything.
And it's interesting. As you go through your telling the story, you sort of go from the broad scope of what's happening down to very specific individuals in certain cases or engagements, and we'll get into a few of those. But one, as I was reading through that, I wasn't expecting was to hear the name Herman Melville come up in this story. Herman Melville, of course, the author of Moby Dick and many other things, but how does he make an appearance in this book on irregular warfare?
I'm sort of fond of Melville because he is an author, and about a decade earlier, he writes Moby Dick. And Moby Dick, as we know, is an American classic, one of the greatest books ever written. But at the time, it wasn't really a commercial success
at all.
And during the American Civil War, Melville is kind of starving, and he then takes it upon himself to embed, using a modern term, with the men of the 2nd Massachusetts Cavalry, whom he's in contact with the leader. He knows them directly and they're friends, and he rides with them. And it's the ride that he captures in a poem, and it's extraordinary poem. Really, it really captures the terror that Mosby, the psychological warfare that he employed, where anyone that entered what is known as at the time as Mosby's Confederacy, it's the Loudoun County and some of the other areas that they felt almost like that they were being watched immediately, and they were. and that there was a Confederate behind every tree. I mean, it was when anybody ever went in there, if it was under 100 men, they were annihilated in most cases, even 200. In the ride that he described, there were several hundred men in the second mass that went on this raid into the territory. And he just describes it in great detail. And I'm also fond of another embedded character in my book, and that's James E. Taylor, who's a combat artist. And Taylor, photography is still in its infancy. It's very hard to lug around equipment to capture, battle as it's taking place. And he's this amazing sketch artist that captures battle in the Shenandoah, and he actually rides with Blazer Scouts and the Jesse Scouts and captures some of their images.
Yeah, and
you have really extraordinary.
You have one of his images in your book, right? I mean, retreating the Confederate retreating through Winchester. It's an amazing piece. So be sure to purchase the book and be able to see that really interesting image. And again, we're with Patrick O'Donnell, and the Unvanquished is his latest work. If you'd like to get a signed copy, just click on the link in our meeting chat that we have up. And if you have a question, by the way, please also put something into the chat section, and we'll go through them and share any that questions you have for Patrick. So we got our Herman Melville fanboy piece out, so we can move on to the next. You had mentioned this name before earlier on in the conversation, Richard Blazer, of Blazer's Independent Scouts. Talk about him in a little more detail, where he came from, how his unit was formed, and what was his work.
He's one of my favorite characters in the book. He's absolutely extraordinary. His story begins in early September 1863, and Richard Blazer is something cut out for Hollywood in the sense that he is not your typical soldier. He would be a flop on the parade ground. This guy had a disheveled uniform all the time. Buttons were off. He has one eye that kind of goes off to the side because he has a condition, esotropia. But the guy is a Confederate manhunter and an awesome detective. And he's 100 years ahead of his time. It's really the origins of modern counterinsurgency can be traced to Blazer and his unit. In a sense that this is the U.S. Army's first modern war, and it's Blazer Scouts that are specifically hunting Confederates, and they're doing it in a modern way. They're not using a blowtorch. They're not just going into villages and rounding people up. They're using, old-fashioned detective work. And Blazer is a guy that's friendly. Later in the Cold War, I believe Lansdale would say the most dangerous weapon in the world is a smile. And it would be something that Blazer would employ. He would smile, and he would also just talk to everybody. And he would become friendly with the youngest, 5-year-old. And he was mining information from people. And he wasn't threatening them. And it was in his mind that he was kind of building a mosaic of what was actionable intelligence and where the Confederates were. And he was acting upon it, and he was extremely effective. He's just he's an older guy. He's in his 30s. At this point in the war, he was a riverboat. He operated like a barge in the Ohio River near Gallipolis. One of the things I do is I actually visited not all, but many of the places that these men were their engagements or skirmishes, but I also go to their graves. And I'll never forget, I went to Richard Blazer's Mound Hill Cemetery, and it's on the Ohio River. And I'm like, okay, I'm just going to go there and I'm going to find his grave through the registry. I get there and I found, oh my God, the place has about 20,000 graves. But I knew I could find him. And within like 20 minutes, I felt this sense and I was guided right to his headstone.
Yeah, well,
And out of a sea of thousands of graves that had been there, since the early 1820s, and it was remarkable. But he's extraordinary, and he's part of this unit. And the Jesse Scouts are intertwined here because he recruits members of the Jesse Scouts. He employs about 16 men out front of his unit as Jesse Scouts to probe, to find weaknesses, to also to sort of act as reconnaissance, and then he ambushes people, and he destroys two of Mosby's companies in two separate engagements, and becomes a absolute menace to Mosby. And it's at a place called Cabletown, or Myersville, Myerstown, West Virginia, which is right on the river. And it's an epic battle that I go into great detail in this book. It's where the Scouts are annihilated. One element of them are annihilated by Mosby's Rangers and his command. And it's Richard Blazer, who's captured by Lewis Powell and several other Rangers. And then Lewis Powell is also a direct connection to the Confederate Secret Service and the Lincoln Conspiracy.
Yes, and we'll talk about him in some detail in a little bit. And you're right, Blazer was fascinating. And you also, as you talk about going into detail in some of these engagements, whether they're big or small, you really are pretty direct with your approach. You don't quite often in some Civil War history books that the cost of war can be a little unknown, but you clearly bring people to life and unfortunately to their demise as well. Can you talk about why you chose to really go into some detail about what happened to some of these Jesse Scouts?
I think it relates directly. I mean, I've been there, and what I mean by that is I've been in a Marine rifle platoon as I was a volunteer civilian combat historian. I was in uniform, but I was armed and I cleared houses with the Marine Corps. So I saw combat firsthand. In fact, we were ambushed multiple times, one time by Chechens, and it was the main character of my book. We were one who was shot in front of me, and I dragged him out under fire. But that experience has crystallized my writing. And it was everything from that to also going home and to telling, 5 or 4 Gold Star families what happened to their sons and how powerful that is. I'm going to be going to our reunion at Camp Pendleton, our 20-year reunion at Fallujah, in November. And, I've had this lifelong bond with the Marines that I was with there. But We Were One has been on multiple commandants' reading lists because it's raw, it's gritty, it's what war is, and that translates into the other books I've written.
Yeah,
directly and indirectly.
Yeah, it comes through, and I think in a very positive way. Again, showing you the true cost of what these men on both sides did, and how brutal it was too. That's the other thing that, particularly with Jesse Scouts, you mentioned this at the very beginning, but quite often dressed in Confederate uniform and therefore considered spies. But it was brutal in many cases, hand to hand or close combat between Scouts. And you share that. And one battle I would like you to talk about, sort of going in further into that, is the Kilpatrick Dahlgren raid of 1864. And then and there's a raid into the South, obviously, to Richmond, hopefully. And what was the Confederate reaction to this? Because I think this was one of those game-changing moments.
It absolutely was. Kilpatrick Dahlgren raid was a raid that was multi-pronged. Dahlgren was to move around the backside of Richmond, while Kilpatrick was to provide the decoy force or distraction to allow that to occur. And within Dahlgren's false leg were secret orders to torch Richmond and also to kill high value targets, leadership of the Confederacy, if they could. And this is explosive stuff for the American Civil War. This is we look at it as a time of honor and everything else. Anyways, the raid kicks off and it doesn't go well. There's a number of factors that take place. There's a ford that's supposed to be crossed, but the river is a little bit higher based on the fact that it's wintertime. They can't find it. They blame the guide that they have, tragically. And it just doesn't go well. Eventually the Richmond Home Guard is able to surround and install Kilpatrick's men, and as other forces move up, and they pretty much take out most of the command. And they find within his leg these secret orders, and immediately the North denies them, that they're fake, that they're, they send General Meade out to tell Lee that this isn't true. They photograph these orders, and the reality is they're real. It's been verified over time that these are legitimate. And what it does is it creates a chain reaction within the South to do something similar. And that something similar is to eventually kidnap the president of the United States, Abraham Lincoln. And the book goes into the multi-faceted aspects of that operation, which are not a bunch of guys like John Wilkes Booth going to a bar and then suddenly meeting up with people like Powell. It just doesn't happen. It's hundreds of people within the Confederate Secret Service, and even John Singleton, Mosby, and his Rangers that are also involved in this kidnapping operation.
Yep, and the name Dahlgren is probably familiar to a lot of people on this call. Rear Admiral John Dahlgren. This was his son, correct?
Correct.
Yeah. So again, that's one of those, I think, a seminal moment of it. And then also you mentioned it a couple of times, but we haven't really gone into any detail, and probably a good time to do so, is about the Confederate Secret Service. What exactly was that? What were they doing? What were they trying to achieve?
I think this is one of the great, in many cases, untold or unknown, underreported for sure, elements of the Civil War. It's an opaque, shadowy organization that is made up of men and women, and they're in a race against time. They realize that the war is about to be lost, and they look at the Secret Service as a means of conducting irregular warfare in novel manners, in different novel ways, to somehow impact or change the course of the war. And it's everything from, freeing potentially over 10,000 prisoners at Point Lookout in Maryland, which was an element of the Jubal Early operation, to direct election interference, specifically, inserting themselves in the Copperhead movement and funding it, specifically funding their leadership, Clement Laird Blandingham, and then even helping write the campaign platform for the Democratic Party in 1864, which is an armistice to end the war through negotiation. It's a course correction for a forever war, as they would call it, that would never end. And this is stuff that there's even within it could be argued as the origins of the Color Revolution, which is an insurrection, which was basically the Northwest Conspiracy, as it was called. It was where there were elements of the Confederate Secret Service that was working with elements of the Copperhead movement to overthrow the governments of Indiana and Illinois. It's fascinating stuff, and within it is also efforts to change the narrative, the democracy, as the Democratic Party at the time loved to call itself, was also in possession, it's one of my favorite lines in the book, of the press, of the Northern press at the time. And they were seeding the Northern press with money to write narratives about the Forever War. And even, then it was even going further, where some editors were funneling arms to the Copperhead movement for the insurrection that was planned. I mean, there's a lot of things here that are fascinating, that are way ahead of their time. And it's why in 1941 we looked at these things, which we can get into.
Yeah, we will, and obviously, for anyone living through the era we're living through, some of these things ring true as well today. You think of online interference, of Russians interfering with elections, and other things happening. There's nothing new under the sun, and so just being able to look back and study this again shows how people react and what the results were. So it's definitely that question again, where history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes, and we sort of move forward. But
what's old is new.
Yeah. What else? Exactly. So you've already dropped this name, and one that'd be very familiar to everyone on this call, John Wilkes Booth, and what was his connection to the Secret Service?
It's what I do is I lay out the evidence, and I let the reader. The evidence is absolutely overwhelming, and it's in many, many, many sources where he's not acting alone. He's funded by, his entire effort takes a massive amount of funding and people behind it, and I present all the evidence to that effect. I also bring out how multiple times he visits Montreal, which is one of the main stations for the Confederate Secret Service. And this is a fascinating, look at the Civil War, where, they're based out of the St. Lawrence Hotel, one of the most opulent hotels in Montreal. And, there's cigar-filled rooms, there's mint juleps that are served year-round to satisfy, the Confederates that are in Canada. And it's in these back rooms that these plots are hatched. Everything from burning New York City to the ground to, germ warfare, to the plot to kidnap the president. And, I bring out all the documentation on that. And it's extensive. And the main thing I look at also, I don't think other authors have, is Lewis Powell in his connection. And his connection is overwhelming, and he was a member of the Confederate Secret Service. And so was John.
Can you go
John
to him?
Surratt.
Yep.
Yeah, and I bring out I bring in the receipts to the table too. I mean, it's like his handlers were all part of the Secret Service. It's not, he doesn't just suddenly, I'm tired of being a Mosby's Ranger and I'm going to defect to, become a civilian. No, it's all I'm going to become a civilian and I'm going to take part in the most dangerous, special operation of the Civil War. And it's all there. It's pretty extraordinary. And then you see that Mosby furnishes him as the muscle, and there's an entire security force down in the Northern Neck, 90 miles away from Mosby's Confederacy, doing nothing. It's like, okay, they're not there for forage. They're there to provide a security detail for when Booth and his men and Powell bring the president across the river.
It's an interesting thought process that you bring, and I agree. You sort of
by the way, I mean, it's like we get into all the details. Oh, by the way, it's Mosby's men that find Booth. It's fascinating. I'm not, I mean, who knows what Mosby, if he knew anything about the assassination. I don't try to get into that, because the assassination itself, the orders, that's hard to prove. But at the kidnapping operation, it's all there, and the infrastructure is there, and the evidence is there. And it's also, I also bring out another operation that, Mosby's last operation of the war is to blow up the White House, and there's the evidence is all there too, where the man, I mean, one of the what I love about the Confederate Secret Service is it's better than Q's laboratory from James Bond. These guys are into gadgets. I mean, they build the first time bombs, they build torpedoes, they build landmines. It's fascinating stuff. And one of the members of what's known as the torpedo department, which is they specialize in explosive devices they're the master of this department, or the head of it is known as a Raines, and his brother is in charge of the arsenal in Georgia that's pumping out the gunpowder for the Confederacy. They're known as the Boom Brothers. They like things that blow up. And they send one of their best men to Mosby in the final days of the war. And, if it wasn't for the 8th Illinois Cavalry outside of Burke, Virginia, that, interrupts this operation, who knows what would have happened.
It is fascinating. And again, you sort of lay it out. You're not drawing too many conclusions because you don't have either. None of us do.
I put the evidence out there and I let the reader decide. Yeah. This book is about putting you in the saddle with these men. This is not some sort of dry textbook. It's there. It puts you there. It's filled with action.
It really is, and we actually have a question. I'll share this with you and see if you have an answer to it. One of our participants named Ron, he said, "Can you speak to Lieutenant John Meigs, I believe it is Meigs, incident involving Mosby's men?" Are you familiar with that story?
No, I mean,
okay.
You have to give me more context. I don't.
All right, Ron, if you can provide more context, Ron, then maybe we can do that. But
it's not one of. Let's just put it this way: it's not one of the book is. It's focused on. It's sort of a band of brothers in a way of the Jesse Scouts in particular. That's the through line of the book, and then Mosby's main men, and then sort of the main figures within the Secret Service that actually. In one way or another, cross or intersect with the two stories, the three stories in general. So,
and before we leave this part of the story, you also mentioned the role of a woman referred to as the French woman. Can you talk about that a little bit?
This is one of my favorite characters in the entire book. I love any female characters that are just. Amazing. And the French woman she's incredible. She's called the French woman because she speaks French. And, it's sort of early mid-war. Her husband is off to war from North Carolina, and she's bored. She doesn't want to sit around. And so what does she do? She does something most women don't do at the time, but, she's courageous and, she joins the Secret Service as a courier between Richmond and Montreal. She speaks French, so she has that as an asset. But she's also, beautiful. She wears a veil most of the time, so she's mysterious. And she moves in and out of these circles. And she is a direct... John Surratt is also a main character within this book, who's one of the great... he's a younger member of the Confederate Secret Service, but he is intimately involved in all of these operations. And he's directly connected with Booth in the kidnapping. And it's the French woman that's often accompanies Surratt and company. And he kind of moves within the circles. It's been surmised that she may have been the one. I mean, there's no evidence of it per se, but may have given the order to Booth directly from Davis to kill the president. But there's no. I mean, that's the one thing I put the evidence on the table. I say that there's no way to prove that.
Yeah, I could imagine that.
But when you got other operations to kill the president, including blowing up the White House, there's things there, right?
Right. I know, absolutely. And so,
and then there's a reason why I mean, this is fascinating too. During the court trial, it's fascinating that it's the Confederate Secret Service that blows up the trial deliberately by lacing it with individuals. The Union has some of their star witnesses happen to be like double agents, and they provide testimony that was probably fed to them by the Secret Service to perjure themselves, and they blow the trial sky high from the perjured testimony. And it's also fascinating to the extent that there's a reason why Secretary of War might not want to basically finger the Secret Service or Davis, because he realizes that might be the beginning of another second Civil War if it's a Secret Service that's implicated in this whole thing. There's a reason to bury it potentially. There's also a reason why that Booth's diary, which contains it's missing many pages, was never part of that original trial, and it later shows up when they try to fire Stanton in the impeachment trial. It's found out that the diary was there and it was buried, by them, which is fascinating.
It is. It's you cover most of this in the book, and so
yeah. But I will mention this one thing: it was never meant to be a conspiracy book in any way, and it was meant to be a book about the Jesse Scouts. But it just happened to be that the main character of this, one of the main characters of the Secret Service and Mosby Scouts, captures one of my main characters, and then takes him to Richmond.
Yep.
Where then he's then he talks to his handlers.
Yeah, and so as we're getting close to the end of our time, but I'd like to get into the end of the war with you a little bit, and starting with the Battle of Five Forks outside of Petersburg, and then going through the role that the Jesse Scouts played there in the last few weeks of the war.
This is huge. Yes. Yeah, this is really an untold story as well. And it's the Jesse Scouts that are sharpened into a strategic asset by General Philip Sheridan. And Sheridan takes these men and really harnesses their potential. And this begins in the Valley in 1864 with the Third Battle of Winchester, where they play a key role in that battle. It's the Jesse Scouts that first interact with Thomas Laws, who's an African American who's enslaved, that they harness this asset to then deliver a message to Rebecca Wright that they're looking for intelligence. And then they're the go-between that harnesses the crucial, strategic level intelligence that a brigade from Jubal Early's army is moving back to Richmond. And it's at that point that Philip Sheridan executes the Third Battle of Winchester, which is a decisive blow to Jubal Early. And it's a decisive blow. It's part of really with the Battle of Atlanta combined with the Third Battle of Winchester, it changes the course of the Civil War in terms of the tone of the election. And it's now thought that the North can win. And it's seismic. And it's, I really get into this information war that is raging and the impact of battles and Mosby's raids on trains and everything else, and how it's feeding into the news cycle, and it's feeding into even operations that the Secret Service have conducted in the Northern press. But this is a major change at that battle, and it's the Scouts that will lead Sheridan's army, and they will lead Sheridan's army at Five Forks, where they play a huge role, finding the weak points in the Confederate line, and they're right beside General Sheridan, who's this is a man of action that literally leads his army from the front. He leads the charge that pierces Pickett's lines. It's an incredible story. I mean, again, I also get into the fish fry and the atmospheric anomaly, all that stuff, and it all sort of combines. But the actions of the Scouts really play a huge role here, and they also play a massive role in after Five Forks, which is arguably one of the most crucial battles of the American Civil War, they are pursuing Lee's army, and they are providing, in some cases they are acting in deceptive manner to have Confederate forces move in different directions. They even capture several generals, but it's the Jesse Scouts that Sheridan directs to go and find Lee's supply trains. And this is absolutely seismic and huge, because without supply, an army marches on its stomach. It's, the Confederate army is starving because of the fact that there weren't supplies at Amelia Courthouse and other places. And it's the nail in the coffin that is so decisive. They seize the supply trains, and then it's Custer's men that eventually surround them. But it has a massive effect on Lee's ability to continue the fight, and his decision at Appomattox. And I even get into another aspect of the war, which has never really been touched. It's how these Jesse Scouts then fight America's first proxy war in Mexico against the European power, where there are tens of thousands of French troops in Mexico supporting, Emperor Maximilian.
That was an interesting way to wrap up the book, and we can, people can obviously look at that and read on. But the interesting role that these Jesse Scouts and other irregulars played, you really bring it all to life, which is fascinating. And I like that you have small chapters that really focus on individual topics, which is a nice way to do it as well. I enjoyed that part of it. And one thing I wanted to close with, two things, a question, follow up on a question. But the first thing is the legacy of the Jesse Scouts and Mosby's Rangers. And particularly, you hinted at this already, but at the beginning of World War II and Colonel Wild Bill Donovan. And could you talk about how that impacted, how the Civil War impacted Donovan's thinking and the forming?
Sure. America has a rich tradition of irregular warfare going back before the French and Indian War. But it's like a sine curve. We develop things and then we just fall off, and it's lost. And it's lost in time. And it's, in modern parlance, the U.S. Army is not necessarily a learning organization. Now, and that is certainly the case in 1941, where Wild Bill Donovan is part of something called the Coordinator of Information. And this is a term that will eventually become the Office of Strategic Services. And in 1941, the United States was the furthest behind all of the major powers. It had not entered World War I, but we didn't have a large standing army. Well, we had no special operations forces at all. And it was Wild Bill Donovan that, recognizes the fact that the United States does have this rich history. And he had within his group a very novel organization called the Research and Analysis Branch. And this is groundbreaking for the time, but it employs some of the greatest scholars in the United States at that time in 1941. And their job was to look at everything from, Eastern Europe and, specific oil supplies, but also there were some great historians there. And he tasked them to looking at specifically our first modern war, which was the Civil War, and the lessons learned from the Jesse Scouts, Mosby's Rangers, and the Confederate Secret Service. And it's he that writes to President Roosevelt this great letter before the war begins. America needs guerrilla bands of bold and daring men organized to sow the dragon's teeth behind the lines, men calculatingly reckless with disciplined daring who are trained for aggressive action. It will mean a return to our old tradition of the Scouts, Raiders, and Rangers. And that begins the OSS's Special Activities Branch, which would become the Special Operations Branch, which would become the Jedburghs, the operational groups, special operators. I've written 5 books on the subject. that's not the story that I wrote in here, but it's just that it's the origin of what, it's where this begins, and it's why that rich legacy from the Civil War now is imbued within our special operations forces to this day. The tradition is carried on from the Civil War to Wild Bill Donovan, the OSS, to later Aaron Bank and the Green Berets, to today's SOCOM and irregular forces that we have. Which, oh, by the way, are influencing our lives and impacting our lives every day. All you have to do is look at the Middle East, where you have the Houthis, an irregular group, which have shut down, a land-based group have shut down the entire Red Sea, which is the first in its kind. It's amazing.
Well, unfortunately, there's always something flaring up in the world that usually grabs attention. And so, this has been a fascinating discussion. I really enjoyed the book, and I encourage everyone to buy it. Again, you purchase through us, you get a nice signed copy of it. I do have one quick follow-up for you on the question on I think it was Lieutenant Meggs. He was Sheridan's aide-de-camp and his chief engineer, and the son of Montgomery Meggs, who was one of the first to be buried in Arlington. And then there was a subsequent shooting, and Sheridan ordered the burning of Dayton, Virginia. But I assume you don't.
Yeah, well, it's kind of interesting. Fort Meigs was the first fort that I ever attended, that I ever went to, which is in Perrysburg, Ohio, when I was about 5. so
Ron,
maybe a connection.
Maybe not the answer you're looking for, Ron, but there's an answer. Well, again, thank you so much for joining us. It's been a great discussion. Thank you for visiting the museum. You mentioned that you're a fan, and we appreciate it.
I encourage everybody to go to it.
And good luck on your next book, which is on? What's next?
Can't get into all the details, but I'm going back to the American Revolution. And it's an elite unit, of course. But yeah, all the book is, the Unvanquished has had just one awesome review after another, from the Wall Street Journal to, we had a great one in Army Magazine, just recently from the West Point professor that said that this book is, really groundbreaking and sheds new light on the Civil War. All the stuff's on Amazon.com or Barnes & Noble. You can see the reviews.
Yeah, you can go look at the reviews of that.
But I buy it from the museum because you can get a signed copy.
Exactly. Great. Again, everyone, thank you for joining us tonight. We are taking August off, but we'll be back in the fall with some online programming, and hope you all have a good night. Again, thank you, Patrick.
Thank you so much for having me. It was an honor and a pleasure.
Have a good night, everybody.
Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming